Now, as parents, all we can ever hope for is that we do as best as possible by our children whilst we're bringing them up. Now, it takes a lot of hard effort and, to an extent, sacrifice over numerous years in order to raise a child correctly. Now, along that parental obstacle course, there are numerous issues that present themselves. In tonight's tale, we look at the events of a life of a young man brought up by a single mother doing as best she can by that child, a boy by the name of John Alexander. Folks, I must warn you that given the nature of the events within this story, I have to advise you that this instalment of The Flip Side is suitable only for adult viewing. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't already, to please subscribe to the channel. If you feel that you've got some spare time, check out any one of the videos in the archives there, and please do slap a like on the ones that take your fancy. Round out that trifecta of support by giving the old notifications bell a bit of a slap so that you'll be updated as and when new content is available from yours truly. But I'd like to also take this opportunity to give a shout out to some of the subscribers of the channel who go the extra mile and interact with me a little bit in the comments section of the videos. So I'd like to say a big thanks to Shirley Comer, Sai Gaming, Justin Bailey, and I hope I get the pronunciation right, Nyctophora. Okay, so for you guys and for everybody, thanks for being a part of this adventure so far. So now, without further ado, let's get into a tale of a childhood destined to go off the rails. This is the sad story of John Alexander Lawson, aka Pazuzu Algarad, here on The Flip Side. San Francisco, August the 12th, 1978. Cynthia Lawson, after an uncomplicated pregnancy, welcomed, along with her husband, Timothy J. Lawson, their son, John Alexander, into the world. Now, Golden Gate City, as San Francisco is also known, back in the 1970s was not the cheapest place to live in America. In fact, far from it. It had long been a mecca for the hipster crowd, and with its proximity to the ocean, that meant that house prices were pretty high. Now, it was also at that time recognised as an emerging hub for the tech industry. Now, as any young family would, the parents doted on their only son. Cynthia would take regular photographs of young John while her husband toiled away trying to make a solid foundation on which it was hoped that the family would flourish. Life in San Francisco weighed a heavy cost of living on the family, which invariably led to arguments between the parents. And to find a solution and hoping for a better outlook, Timothy and Cynthia decided for pastures new, and in 1980, when young John Alexander was aged just 2 years old, the family upped sticks and moved to North Carolina. Now, everything seemed to go well through John's life as a preschooler. He would have the childhood that most kids would have. He'd dress as a cowboy and act out his innocent games, all of which were duly photographed by his mother. The family remained balanced, but with arguments as standard between the parents. Life isn't always a bed of roses. And it was only when the young boys started school that initial problems started to appear. Not being the most attentive student, young John failed his second grade expectations of his teachers and was forced to retake it. This then moved him back a year in his studies, and as such it has been said that the ridicule that he received from the kids around him at that time formed the reclusive individual that he would go on to become. And with things at home not faring any better, by the time he was just 8 years old, the relationship between his parents, Timothy and Cynthia, had deteriorated to such a point that the parents decided to divorce. With the emotional toil that came from the divorce weighing heavily on the young boy who had doted on his father, the downward mental slide of John Alexander was put in motion. With his father moving back to California, both John and Cynthia stayed put in North Carolina. And just a few years later, when Johnny, as his mother would call him, was aged 12, she would remarry. Cynthia and John moved into the home of John Larry James, who lived in Clemens, North Carolina. The family, it seemed, were on the right track to make a fresh start. But sadly, it was from this point on that John Alexander would start to change, and change for the worst. At age just 13, the young lad had already developed a damaging relationship with alcohol. and would frequently consume a 12-pack of beer in a day. John would often confide in his mother about his feelings of having been deserted, abandoned and betrayed by his blood father. Now, as with all teenagers, as they grow, the parents do expect some kind of pushback. It's normal. Kids are trying to find themselves, trying to find their place in the world. Hormones are raging and questions arise. It's all a standard part of growing up. Now, in John Alexander's case, though, things would take a drastic and ultimately a deadly turn. Given that schooling had always been a weak link for the boy, it was after sitting his 9th grade and failing for the second time that John simply decided that school wasn't for him. So he dropped out. Spiralling out of control, John would change his appearance, shaving his trademark blonde flowing locks down to the bone and adopting a more gothic kind of style. After having left school behind, the young lad made no attempt to start providing for himself. In fact, far from it. Becoming entangled in the world of drugs as both a user and dealer, he would often have rows with his stepfather, John, about items and cash that had gone missing from the family home. Throughout this time, young Johnny had also started to become increasingly interested in the occult, and in particular, Satanism. He would watch horror movies on loop and read books on all things related to this dark sector of religious beliefs. And it wasn't until 2012 that he would ultimately and legally change his name to that by which many people know or knew him as, and that is Pazuzu Algarad. So what's in a name? Well, Pazuzu is the name of an Assyrian demon whose name was used in the movie The Exorcist. With that film having been one of young Johnny's favourite, it came as no surprise to those who knew him at the time that he had adopted that name. His second name was taken from the Arabic language and was a term used to describe God. And his surname, also from the Arabic language, has been said by some, depending on the dialect taken, as a word that means announcing. Now, from this point forward, Pazuzu would take on a very different existence to the one that preceded him when everybody knew him as John. He would transition from an energetic, focused, and to an extent ambitious young man into a solemn, dark and almost silent entity. It was obvious at this stage in his life that there must have been specific mental health drivers responsible for the most part in his dramatic transformation. After medical evaluation, it was discovered that not only was Pazuzu schizophrenic, but he also suffered from agoraphobia, a condition that would induce a fear of being in open spaces and surrounded by crowds. This afforded Pazuzu the perfect conditions in which to slide into a reclusive and depraved existence. And it was from this point forward that things really started to deteriorate. With everything going the way it was, it came as no surprise that the relationship between Pazuzu's mother, Cynthia, and his stepfather would suffer. And towards the end of the same year, 2012, they would divorce. Left fending for themselves, Pazuzu and his mother would occupy different parts of the house, with Cynthia pretty much resigned to living in her bedroom with the ensuite shower and bathroom facility that it had. They would share the kitchen, but would hardly ever encounter each other there. As severe depression would confound his already troubled mind, he would be prescribed medication to try and help him navigate the dark waters associated with that condition. Now, as with any medication in Pazuzu's life, they were subsequently abused and forgotten. Pazuzu took to body modification, scarring and tattoo as a way to convey his motivation in life. And it wasn't long before his body became covered in satanic tattoos and emblems. Wanting to look more serpent-like, Pazuzu went as far as having his tongue split down the middle. In a bizarre move, Pazuzu also began braiding metals into his hair, and in a dramatic move opted to no longer wash or brush his teeth. He claimed that modern cleaning materials were a way of reducing one's ability to develop immunity against disease. He saw it as a way of making him stronger. Now, it was at this point in his life where many people point a finger of partial blame towards Pazuzu's mother, Cynthia. In this dark chapter in his life, of which would only get darker, he had taken to animal sacrifice. And every month, on the full moon, he partook in a particularly disturbing ritual. His mother would scour the local pet stores for rabbits, and she would then hand them over to her son, who would take the animal to the banks of the local Yadkin River. And it was on the banks of the river and hidden by vegetation that Pazuzu would remove and devour the rabbit's hearts. He would then offer the animal to Satan and drink its blood. He once confided in his mother that this ritual would make him feel alive and give him an incredible rush, vastly unlike anything that he'd ever encountered with synthetic drugs. Now, in his social life, limited as it was, Pazuzu did actually have a loose collection of friends, followers, and even lovers. Although never officially married, he would call a young lady by the name of Amber Birch, who was also known as Bubbles, his wife. Amber, in turn, accepted that position with complete and utter submission. Now, it seemed that the young couple, along with a small band of friends and associates, would often partake in bloodletting in local graveyards around the town, as well as partying, binge drinking, and organising the occasional orgy in Pazuzu's home, all while his mother remained in her room. Among those who associated with him, Pazuzu's house was seen as a place of refuge from the norms of society, where people could be themselves without retribution, question, or consequence, where they could do as they wished without scorn or ridicule. This haven of depravity was heralded via the handwritten note that welcomed anyone who approached the front door. It was a sign that was duly signed by Pazuzu, Amber, and their limited circle of friends. It read as follows: "No gang members allowed. Anyone that dresses the same, has the same badge, and calls themselves the authority of a land they did not create, they only seized through terrorism, has no permission to enter this land. Unless, of course, you are a native and that this land is theirs. Since this is the First Amendment of your fake laws, for we see you as guilty until proven innocent, if you can make laws, so can we. So be it." Now, among other things, Pazuzu was also fascinated by the murderous cult leader Charles Manson, and in a certain sense of emulation, began to create his own version of a family. This was initiated by inviting an array of predominantly young women to live with him, all of whom he referred to as his fiancées. One of these young ladies, a girl by the name of Crystal Matlock, would ultimately become another close partner of both Pazuzu and Amber. The three of them embarked on a life fueled by drugs, alcohol, and they would on occasion invite numerous other young people from the village to partake in orgies at Pazuzu's house. Again, all while Pazuzu's mother Cynthia remained in her bedroom within earshot of the gatherings. Now, as one can imagine, given that the house for the larger part was occupied by those without a care for cleanliness or order, it soon became trashed. Its walls were festooned with satanic graffiti, while its floors were littered with household, food, animal and human waste. In the gatherings that ensued, it became standard for Pazuzu to claim that he had also carried out acts of murder and subsequent mutilation of the corpses. And one story that he would often tell that seemed to repeat itself was that Pazuzu, after having killed a couple of prostitutes, then started to devour certain parts of their body before disposing of the bodies, either by burying them in his backyard or throwing them in the local Yadkin River. These stories were always shrugged off by his friends, who thought they stemmed from a result of his diminished mental state, mixed with the large amounts of drugs and alcohol that he would consume. Now, even though they were skeptical about these stories, they would say this one thing, that Pazuzu would always recount them in a way that seemed completely cold, and that he was very much aware of the words that he was speaking. Now, as time wore on, the condition of the house deteriorated. After a few years, the situation had become so bad that the floors could no longer be seen under the mountains of litter and animal feces that covered it. Given that concoction of ingredients, it was also said that the house smelled like nothing anyone could ever imagine. Neighbours complained to the local authorities, but it seemed to no avail. Pazuzu would frequently adorn the walls with inscriptions and satanic markings, inked from his own blood. On numerous occasions, he was also known and seen to urinate and defecate on the floor in front of his friends. To add a greater sense of shock to his appearance, Pazuzu had also by now filed his teeth down into sharp points, transforming him into a demonic-looking character whenever he would open his mouth. He was now, and had been for some time, completely out of control. Many people would ask why the authorities wouldn't intervene at this point, but in the cold light of day, nothing that Pazuzu was currently engaged in behaviour-wise could be deemed as illegal. He had since stopped, by all accounts, the devouring of rabbit hearts, so animal cruelty was no longer a case against him. Historically, yes, but given that he had engaged in that activity alone and had simply recounted for police reports, there was no evidence, no proof, and no eyewitnesses to corroborate those events. Pazuzu continued to recount tales of his murderous exploits, on one occasion alluding to having a body stashed in the basement of the house, a body he said as being that of a homeless man that he had shot 6 times. He went on to suggest that he had camouflaged the smell of decay with the use of cat litter and bleach. But that said, given the stench of the house anyway, it would have been hard to discern the smell of human decomposition amidst the ingredients that contributed to its unique aroma. This tale was recounted one last time towards the end of July 2009, according to Terina Billings. Terina lived with her single father, who would also hang out with the people that frequented the household due to a kind of loose relationship that he was having with Crystal Matlock at the time. She further recounts that her father confided in her that he had actually helped bury the body of a man that had been left in the basement of Pazuzu's house. Now, armed with this evidence, Terina filed a police report on August 3rd, 2009, and it marked the first date that Pazuzu, at that time aged 21, would be drawn to the attention of the local law enforcement. Now, it was amazing to Terina that the police would actually go to Pazuzu and simply ask him if the stories were true. Now, given the obvious sign on the front door, it came as no surprise to anybody that Pazuzu would deny both the fact that a killing had taken place and also denied the request that the police be allowed to take a search of the premises. Now, to reinforce this claim that Pazuzu had actually disposed of a body on his property, an anonymous tip arrived on the desk of local law enforcement about a month later on September 24th, 2009. And again, the police did nothing with it. Being shocked at the way this was being ignored by law enforcement, and with great risk to herself, Terina once again returned to the house of Pazuzu for a night of drinking. But this time, she had come prepared. Taped to her body, she had an audio recorder, and she was hoping to record the words coming directly from the mouth of Pazuzu himself. As was customary, the night devolved into an event of binge drinking and bloodletting, and once again Pazuzu would clearly be recorded as saying that he had killed someone and disposed of the body in his backyard. A story that seemed to be backed up by other people in attendance. Incredibly, and even armed with what to all extents and purposes amounted to a self-confession of murder and disposal of a corpse by Pazuzu, the local law enforcement failed to act. As word of Pazuzu and his lifestyle started to spread around the younger teenage fraternity, it came to the attention of a young mother by the name of Stacy Wetzler. Stacy lived in neighbouring Virginia, where she had been desperately searching for a number of months for her one-time partner and father of their young son, a man by the name of Josh Wetzler. After the horse rehabilitation business that both Stacy and Josh had planned to start together folded due to the financial crisis that was sweeping across the United States at the time, Josh had unfortunately taken to drugs and drug dealing as a way to cope with the impact of his life as a young and unemployed parent. Needless to say, things hadn't worked out between Josh and Stacy, and the two parted company as partners but remained friends. On hearing about the activities at the Pazuzu family house, Stacy eventually lodged a complaint in February of 2010 and requested that police carry out a search for Josh, or remains of Josh, at the Pazuzu property. And it was only after this that law enforcement would finally swing into action in this case. Sadly, hope transitioned into despair, as on this fourth instance of Pazuzu being reported to police and even armed with cadaver dogs in their subsequent search, no bodies or body parts were found either within the property or grounds of the home. Now, Pazuzu and his family carried on with their extreme lifestyle. At times this spiraled to new depths, and in May of 2010, Pazuzu was observed by some of his fiancées, including Amber, when he placed his mother, Cynthia, in a neck hold and choked her to a point of unconsciousness. Fearing that her son was descending to dangerous new depths, Cynthia would end up pressing charges against him, only to retract them at a later date. Now, on June 7, 2010, local law enforcement were investigating the case of a murdered man by the name of Joseph Chandler, whose body had been found along the banks of the Yadkin River. CCTV footage from a local convenience store clearly showed the African-American Chandler in the company of both Pazuzu and an associate of his, a man by the name of Nicholas Rizzi, one day prior to Chandler's body being found. Now, Chandler was no angel. He'd had issues with law enforcement in the past, but who was, at the time of his murder, trying to get his life back on track, and he worked as a trainee chef at a local food establishment. He had been dispatched with a shot to the back of the head, almost execution style. Now, through the investigation, his murder was ultimately attributed to Nicholas Rizzi. Now, even though he had nothing to do with the death of Chandler directly, Pazuzu tried to cover for his friend, and for his troubles ended up being slapped with a 5-year probationary sentence for accessory to murder. And it was a sentence that was to be served at his domicile, which of course suited Pazuzu down to the ground. The violence, it seemed, was becoming part and parcel of life within the Pazuzu household, and in the following year it was Amber who would assault Pazuzu's mother, Cynthia. Becoming the target on numerous times of physical attack, Cynthia would never again file charges against Amber, or for that matter any of her aggressors, citing the fear that she had of her son and his religious practices. Now, it seemed to many that this roller coaster ride of craziness would continue unabated, but it was all about to come crashing down around Pazuzu in October 2014. During a night of heavy partying, Pazuzu asked one of his closest friends, a man by the name of Matt Flowers, if he would be willing to help Pazuzu murder someone at a later date. Now, it was a proposition that Matt refused, saying that he basically didn't have the guts for it. Given that the target of Pazuzu's ire was actually in attendance on that very same evening, Matt was able to take that person to one side later on in the evening and inform them that they'd better get the heck out of Dodge. And it was a suggestion that was duly accepted, and that person went running off into the night. Now, being asked to help in the murder of another human being must leave a pretty indelible mark on one's conscience, and as it did with Matt. So much so, to a point that Matt eventually went to the police and filed a report about the proposition. Matt was, in fact, a veteran serviceman, and even though his choice of social circles left something to be desired, it did instill a sense of conclusiveness when he submitted the details of the proposition and his personal observations of Pazuzu to the police. It was based on this new evidence against Pazuzu that the police would once again carry out a search warrant at the house. And what they found this second time around would shock not just the most hardened of investigators to the core, but would also send shockwaves of horror and disbelief throughout the local and statewide communities. On October 5th, 2014, local law enforcement enacted a search warrant at the house shared by Pazuzu and his mother, Cynthia. Everyone who was in attendance at the time of the warrant being served, namely Pazuzu, Cynthia, Amber, and a number of other fiancés, were all vacated by law enforcement so that they could carry out the search unhindered. Hit with a stench that felt like they'd walked into a physical wall, the police officers would find a house decorated with all manner of satanic emblems, some of which looked to have been painted with human blood. Infested with flies, both living and dead, the rotting food that littered the house undulated with the swollen masses of maggots that were gorging on them. Human and animal waste littered the floor throughout the property. Now, other than the human inhabitants at the time of the search, the house also served as home to 15 cats, several dogs, a handful of snakes and other wildlife. Now, these were all slated for sacrifice at some point or another during their lives by Pazuzu. In many areas of the house, it was impossible to see the floor, and in the areas of carpets that were visible, it was clear that they were caked with feces, both human and animal. All of the walls were in no better conditions, moulded to a point of total blackness that would also spread across the ceilings. Taking the search to the basement, the police noted that again the space was in total disarray. Given that this area also had a greater exposure to the outdoors, it was clear that things would decompose a lot faster in this space. Police noted an area that seemed to have a heavy presence of both cat litter and bleach, and this alone cast the minds of investigating officers back to reports about Pazuzu, who had often claimed that he had covered up the decomposing body of a vagrant that he had killed in the basement of the house. Now, walking from the basement to the garden at the rear of the property, the police soon realised that the garden had indeed been dug up, and there were certain locations that had dips in them, and it wasn't level, as any untouched area of garden should be. This, in turn, gave the police reason to further excavate the premises. When they eventually did start to dig, it was then that their suspicions were soon confirmed. They would go on to find the bodies of 2 unknown males in shallow graves in the back garden. So decomposed were the 2 victims that forensic scientists would only have dental records to go on in order to try and identify these 2 guys. Eventually the 2 men were identified. One was indeed the body of Josh Wetzler, and the other was of a man by the name of Tommy Welch, who had disappeared some 5 years prior from Clemens, North Carolina, the town he unfortunately shared with Pazuzu. Now, unbeknown to those who were searching for him, it seemed that Josh Wetzler, a man of whom it was said had deep empathy for the disadvantaged people in society, had actually been staying at the house for around a month before being killed, and there was never any reason given for his murder. Now, upon autopsy, it was found that both men had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun in almost execution style. Through interrogation after their arrest, it was found that Pazuzu was responsible and testified as such for the death of Josh Metzler, while it was Amber, Pazuzu's wife, who had killed Tommy Welch. Amber was also found guilty as an accessory after the fact in the murder of Metzler. And so this sad tale is drawn to a close. At 0300 hours on October 28, 2015, while awaiting trial for his part in the murder of Josh Metzler, the unresponsive body of Pazuzu Algarad was found in his jail cell at the Raleigh Central Prison in North Carolina. Lacking the spine to deal with the responsibilities of his actions, Pazuzu had taken his own life. Now, Amber Birch, the self-appointed wife of Pazuzu, was duly indicted by a grand jury to serve a sentence of 39 years, with credit for time served prior to the hearing. Her charges were for the murder of Tommy Welch, the subsequent stealing of his possessions from his corpse, as well as being accessory to the murder after the fact of Wetzler. Given that love is blind, it seems that Pazuzu's additional close female companion, Crystal Matlock, also carried out actions in connection to these killings that would land her in prison. She would ultimately plead guilty in June 2017 to accessory after the fact of first-degree murder. She was duly convicted to serve a total of 4 years and 10 months for her role in helping with the disposal of both of the bodies. Now, in one last reflection in this case, what about the role of Pazuzu's mother, Cynthia? It was found that she was present throughout many of the events as outlined in this story. This included being in the house and present at the time when both murders were committed. During the course of the subsequent investigation, it was found that she even came out of her room on the night of the Tommy Welch slaying after hearing the shots ring out. And when doing so, she saw Pazuzu standing over the body of the victim, the air still thick with the smell of the shotgun having discharged. Cynthia then casually stepped back into her room, got ready for and left for work. And yet, incredibly, she received no sentence for her role in any of the events, not for the provision of animals to be cruelly slaughtered in satanic rituals, and neither for withholding information about the commission of crimes by Pazuzu to law enforcement. Some would say that her failing as a mother contributed to a large extent to the depths of behaviour to which Pazuzu would descend. Free from any constraint, the young man was able to become as wild as he did, all because his mother simply wanted him to be himself. But folks, my question to you, if this was your son in a theoretical situation, would you inform law enforcement of his crimes and behaviour? please comments down below. Now this sad story illustrates on so many levels how society failed this young lad. Now while this in no way should admonish Pazuzu and those around him for the actions that they carried out, it can be said to an extent that this could have been avoided. Cynthia, the one person who should have had the best interests of her only son at heart, failed to offer him the guidance and support that any parent worth their salt should provide. Now Pazuzu was a psychopath, there's no denying that. But suffering with severe depression, alcoholism, schizophrenia, agoraphobia, panic disorder and severe anxieties, his is a sad case indeed. But there is no way that he should have been left to his own devices and expected to exist without problems in a functioning society. Even sadder is the fact that his actions, being left unchecked, culminated in the devastating loss of loved family members from both the Metzler and Welch families. Now the House of Horrors where all of this took place was eventually destroyed, given that it would probably have cost more to have it cleaned than it would to have had it rebuilt. This took place just a few months after the findings of the bodies of Wetzler and Welch, once the investigation had all been wrapped up. And to this day, the plot of land remains vacant. So there you have it folks, the story of Pazuzu Algarad. A sad tale indeed, of a young boy being neglected by both society and by those who should have been his greater protectors in life, his parents. Now, whatever your take may be on this case, please, if you feel so moved to do so, leave your comments below. And if you haven't already, please do feel free to subscribe and also slap a like on any one of the videos in the archives thus far. To round out that trifecta of support, please also give that notifications bell a humongous uppercut so that it will feel obliged to send you an update as and when new content is uploaded by yours truly. Now, as always, I'd also like to ask if you're so moved to suggest a potential story for future inclusion on this channel, please feel free to do so in the comments below and I'll start researching that ASAP. But anyway, until the next time folks, as always, stay safe, stay sane and above all, stay healthy. And we'll meet again, hopefully sometime soon, here on the flip side.